Princess Victoria became Queen Victoria in 1837. She died in 1901, and that long span of 64 years we call for convenience the Victorian era. What was it like to be a Victorian during the first half of this period? Oh, say from 1837 to 1870, the years when Charles Dickens was writing his novels. It was an age of startling contrasts, of artistic bad taste in some fields, and of artistic triumph in others, of morality and hypocrisy, of splendor and squalor, and the most striking contrast of all, of prosperity and poverty. Benjamin Disraeli was twice Queen Victoria's Prime Minister. He also wrote novels, and in one of them he makes a character refer to England's two nations, the privileged and the people. The privileged and the people. Wealth and grinding poverty. How true was this? Well, in 1842, there was an official investigation of working conditions in the coal mines of England, and various witnesses came to testify before the commission. One of them spoke these words. I am Sarah Gooder. I am 8 years old. I'm a coal carrier in the Gorba mine. It does not tire me, but I have to trap without a light, and I'm scared. I go at 4 and sometimes 3:30 in the morning, and come out at 5 and 5:30 in the evening. I never go to sleep in the pit. Sometimes I sing when I have light, but not in the dark. I dare not sing then. I don't like being in the pit. I'm very sleepy when I go in the morning. I go to Sunday school and learn to read, and they teach me to pray. I've heard tell of Jesus many a time. I don't know why he came on earth. I don't know why he died. But he had stones for his head to rest on. Sarah Gooder, coal carrier, 8 years old. But what of the other side of the coin? Just 9 years after little Sarah Gooder had testified, another witness spoke for England, and this witness was a building, a vast and wonderful structure of glass and cast iron, erected in Hyde Park, London, and known as the Crystal Palace. In 1851, under the sponsorship of Prince Albert, Victoria's German-born husband, the Crystal Palace was opened to the public. It housed the Great Exhibition, and the Great Exhibition displayed to the whole world Victorian England's truly marvelous achievements in trade, industry, science, and technology. In the mid-19th century, the Great Exhibition symbolized British progress and power. It stands at one extreme. At the other extreme, we have the testimony of an 8-year-old coal carrier, Sarah Gooder, who said, "Sometimes I sing when I have light, but not in the dark. I dare not sing then." In between the Crystal Palace and Sarah Gooder lies the rest of England. Let's now block in some of its main features in terms of the man who was perhaps its greatest observer, Charles Dickens. As I said, Dickens reflected his age, attacked it, and transcended it. But we must add a fourth relationship of Dickens to his age. He ignored it. There are certain areas of English life which seemed not to interest Dickens, at least as far as material for his novels went. For example, to get a broad, realistic picture of the clergy of his day, or of the political life of the era, or the life of the landed gentry and the fox-hunting squires, for all this, it's better to turn to another bearded Victorian novelist, Anthony Trollope. And if you were looking for a picture of the great, the fashionable world of the aristocracy, you'd find it better portrayed in the works of William Makepeace Thackeray. Dickens, too, like Thackeray, wrote about the shams and hypocrisies, the snobbery of class-conscious England. But Thackeray, born a gentleman, knew the world of the aristocracy from the inside out, whereas Dickens, in a way, never escaped from his unhappy lower middle-class origins. And there's something else you won't find reflected in Dickens. Any sense of the great outsized personalities who flourished in Victorian England and who helped to change its spirit. Florence Nightingale, whom we should remember whenever we see a modern hospital. George Stephenson, one of the men who in a few short years laid down the basis for the British railway system. Charles Darwin, who shook the world to its foundations with his theory of evolution. Cardinal Newman, convert to Catholicism, subtle theologian and brilliant philosopher of education. John Stuart Mill, champion of liberty and the emancipation of women, reformer on a dozen fronts. People such as these are not to be found in Dickens' novels, and yet they were among the giants who shaped the Victorian world. Living in an age that was, for many, one of prosperity and security, they dared to question its basis. They acted as the ferment of their time. They forced their countrymen to grow in spirit. And one of them, in some ways the greatest, was Dickens himself. He had a gift the others didn't possess. He touched people's hearts. He played like a musician on their emotions. He gripped their imaginations. No novelist before his time had reached so many people so directly. It's hard for us to understand what a powerful influence the novel was in those days, and especially the novels of Dickens. Often they appeared in fortnightly parts, one installment at a time. And as G.K. Chesterton has put it, in the days when Dickens' work was coming out in serial, people talked as if real life were itself the interlude between one issue of Pickwick and another. Dickens was not a philosopher, not an intellectual, indeed not even a very well-educated man, but he understood intuitively the spirit of his age. Even when he attacked it, he was part of it. How shall we characterize that age? Behind all the contradictions that we've already mentioned lay one underlying driving force, the impulse toward growth. Other words have been applied to it. It's been called the age of imperialism, of expansion, of trade, of progress, of optimism. But all these words suggest growth. They weren't satisfied, like Herbert, just to look about them. These new enterprising people, of whom Herbert himself wants to be one, were the middle class. And it is they, the middle class, who dominate the life of the period, supply many of its ideas, produce many of its men and women of high ability. They had astounding energy, these new middle-class men, with their passion for trade, machinery, commerce, markets, expansion, in a word, growth. As men of business, they were bold, imaginative, and often ruthless. But in their social and private lives, they stressed respectability and convention. And here their model was probably the royal family. The Queen and Prince Albert lived a well-publicized life of domestic virtue, piety, decorum, and their middle-class subjects for the most part imitated them. The conduct of the middle class, then, was dominated by respectability. But their minds were dominated by optimism, a belief which to us today seems a little naive in the inevitability of progress in all fields, moral, intellectual, economic. And as a matter of fact, there seemed to be some justification for this optimism. The Industrial Revolution was transforming society. The Age of Steam, as it was often called, did make possible a vast flow of products which streamed outward to every corner of the world. And back from every corner, including England's far-flung colonial possessions, came a return stream, to echo Herbert Pocket, of silks, shawls, dyes, precious woods, even elephant tusks. Finally, this optimism rested on the reality of peace, just as our uncertainty is based on the fear of war. I, who am in my 50s, have lived through 2 world wars and half a dozen smaller ones. But remember that during the entire 64 years of Queen Victoria's reign, there was no major war. These were the people, then, for whom Dickens wrote his novels. These respectable, pious, energetic, optimistic, and often materialistic people of the dominant middle class, the class to which, once having achieved success, he himself belonged. Some of their beliefs he shared. Some, as we shall see, he transcended, but others he loathed. For example, he is aware of the sordid reality that lay back of Herbert Pocket's innocent dreams of wealth. Perhaps you remember Marley's ghost in A Christmas Carol and his complaint to Scrooge. My spirit never walked beyond our counting house. In life, my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole. But the Victorians were not all Marleys and Scrooges by any means. With prosperity assured, they too, like most of us, wanted some of the good things of life. And these good things they found, following the example of royalty, in the comforts and dignity of family life. These comforts and this dignity depended to a great extent on the possession of things, on the enjoyment of large, heavy dinners eaten in large, fussy houses, on the display of works of art, all too often bad art. The title of this painting is The Suffering Husband by Augustus Egg. Why is the husband suffering? What is contained in the letter he clutches hopelessly in his hand? Why is his wife weeping? Charles Dickens was well aware of the absurdity of this emphasis on pious morality. He attacks it again and again. This high moral tone was set by the Victorian father inside his home, though not always outside it. The household was often ordered like a petty kingdom, with the heavy father as the autocratic tyrant, his wife and children as the court retainers, and an army of servants as the carefully graded ordinary subjects. Behavior was formal, etiquette rigid. And there you have the Victorian weakness. All this striving for respectability, for gentility, for a high moral tone, all this went against the grain of human nature. The Victorian had to pay for it, and he paid for it by an inner unhappiness. Behind the smooth, formal surface of his home life, there often lay friction, hypocrisy, and divided souls. Thus, in his more critical moments, the Victorian could not help feeling that his success and prosperity, even his so-called morality, were built on the unhappiness of others, one of whom might be little Sarah Gooder. Often he was riddled with guilt, preyed upon by melancholia. Often his personality was split. It's no accident that Robert Louis Stevenson's story about a man with 2 personalities, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, should have appeared in 1886 at the very height of Victorian power. The Victorian period itself was both Jekyll and Hyde. Like Mr. Merdle, it looked in the mirror and often did not like what it saw. It saw progress, it saw growth, it saw prosperity, but it also saw the cost of these things. And that's why we must describe this great period not only as a period of growth and optimism, but as a period of reform. The reaction to Victorian complacency, optimism, and piety was reform. Florence Nightingale, Matthew Arnold, John Stuart Mill, Charles Dickens, these were not voices crying in the wilderness. They were listened to. The abuses to which they pointed were often, if slowly, corrected. And the terrible gap between Disraeli's 2 nations was gradually bridged.